All right. The next speaker was trained as a geographer at the Florida State University. After grad school, he accepted a postdoc position as a research physical scientist with the Agricultural Research Service of the USDA. Afterward, he gained industry experience with the Precision Ag Company and a company that manufactures multispectral sensing systems. He then joined the faculty in the Department of Plant Agriculture at the University of Guelph. He is actively collaborating with Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs and plant breeders to investigate how remote sensing can enhance phenotyping efforts in beans, wheat, soybeans, and corn. In addition, he is helping plan projects examining changes in pollinator habitat in orchards and disease incidents in vineyards. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Dr. John Sulik.
Good morning. I was asked to speak about the Food from Thought program at Guelph. So similar to the PERC program here, Guelph just recently started an initiative that goes over and addresses research excellence. And it's the Canada First Research Excellence Fund. And we've got about a little under $80 million over the next 7 years, and we're engaging lots of faculty and students and trying to reach out to industry and growers as part of this Food from Thought program, which is basically about environmentally sustainable crop production, which is a lot harder than it sounds. So I'm just going to talk about some of the basics of how I'm involved with that and where I see that going forward. I would like to preface saying that I recently joined the faculty at Guelph in June. So I don't have any results or stuff to show you. It's just going to be talking about a lot of the personalities involved and what we hope to achieve. So there are 3 basic missions from the Food from Thought program. We're looking at things at different scales, different levels, going from the global scale to the landscape scale down to micro scale addressing disease issues. So at the global scale, we're trying to transform agriculture's impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services. The ecosystem services is the important part we want to pay attention to, because in a lot of traditional agricultural approaches, the ecosystem services are neglected or possibly even harmed. So we want to try to find ways to have agriculture have a positive or less of a negative impact on these ecosystem services, which are things like pollinator habitat or water quality. Looking at things at the landscape scale, we're trying to investigate ways to sustainably intensify production. And sustainable so that, for generations to come, there's going to be food. And at the micro scale, there's a lot of animal and livestock researchers looking at things to enhance food and livestock health. New hires from the Food from Thought program, it's really an exciting time to be at Guelph because there are a lot of very established, respected researchers there with some solid research programs going on. But then they've also taken and started hiring some new people. So I started in June. Shortly after me, in the middle there is Karam. He's a biostatistician, and he's going to be the glue on doing a lot of linking different results and synthesizing them to do the big data analysis. And on the left side there are some livestock researchers who are really sharp, and I've got a lot of high hopes for them and what we're all going to be able to achieve together. For agronomy, ecosystem services, this is something that I really am very most interested in, is the agronomic side of things. I am doing collaborations with the breeders, but I really need to reach out to a lot of growers and try to help develop ways that we can minimize impact on these ecosystem services. And so there are programs that we're looking at working on hydrological modeling, looking at nitrogen efficiencies in terms of management for like corn nitrogen management, but also in breeding. Selecting varieties that are genetics that are most suitable for generating their own nitrogen, and the big data analysis section. Someone else that's new at Guelph, who isn't Food from Thought, but I decided to mention to you all here, is Dr. Adam Gillespie. And so I'm going to be doing some collaboration with him using gamma ray spectroscopy to map soil attributes, because precision agriculture is really tenuous in many respects, but two of the areas that are very productive to date are yield mapping and soil mapping. And he's got some very innovative new ideas on how we can use the gamma spectroscopy for doing the soil mapping. So he's someone else to watch out for. And so I've got some really high hopes for our collaborations. Now I'm just going to drill down and talk about a specific project that I'm working on with the bean breeders at Guelph. And this is under a Food from Thought section called Approaches for Efficient Food Production and Providing Ecosystem Services. And it's a bean diversity and nitrogen efficiency trial. So the breeder's trying to find ways to transition to lower fertilizer use. And so this is a very large bean nitrogen trial that's at the Allure Research Station in Guelph. And this is an image that just shows you an overview of how big it is. And this data was collected using drone imagery, which is very cumbersome and laborious to process. I would like to say I visited some of the computer scientists here in Saskatoon, and they've been working on some very impressive ways to automate ways to generate maps like this. And a lot of time and effort actually went into making a map that was, I thought, very accurate and showing variation in the leaf chlorophyll, which is related to the leaf nitrogen that the researchers after. After having seen what the computer scientists are here doing, it really gives me a lot of relief because the amount of effort and time I or other people would have to spend to generate data like this is going to be so greatly reduced, and we can focus our efforts on other things. So I just wanted to give some recognition to that team there and what they've been able to do in terms of really making things scalable. A lot of this making things more high throughput means making them scalable and reproducible with minimal effort and intervention on behalf of the researchers. So that's one of the outputs of the map. And so the researchers really interested in mapping variation in the nitrogen in the plants. And so from a remote sensing perspective, you're not really mapping the nitrogen so much as you're mapping something that's very, very closely correlated with the nitrogen, which is the leaf chlorophyll. And so for leaf chlorophyll content, what you're trying to do is quantify the amount of chlorophyll per unit area, and that's per unit leaf area. And I've noticed a lot of people who are getting into doing high throughput phenotyping and offering services for doing plot level data extraction, they seem to be overlooking the fact that it's per unit leaf area and not per unit ground area. So if you look at the units that different people use, it could be micrograms of chlorophyll per square centimeter or per square meter, whatever it is. You'll often see, this is an example of that same nitrogen trial. And what I did is I calculated an index that's sometimes considered a chlorophyll index, NDRE. I won't bore you with the details on it, but just know that it's showing variation supposedly in leaf chlorophyll. But when you make a map like this, you can see that I overlaid in those black rectangles the plot boundaries for each of the different replications. People will just average all of the pixels within each boundary, and they'll use a poor chlorophyll index such as NDVI or a so-so one like NDRE, but they'll just average every single pixel within that area. What you need to do is actually just map the leaf pixels. And when you have complex crop canopies that could have soil or other features in them like flowers, it's really important to remove those pixels before doing the statistical summaries. And so this isn't analytics, but it's preparing the data for analytics so that you can reach the proper conclusions from your data analysis. And this is a large part of what I'm like to focus on. So something else that you get from a multispectral camera flight when you fly a drone, if you use a lawnmower grid pattern, is what's called a digital surface model. And these digital surface models show variation in elevation. And in these maps here, brighter pixels are higher elevation, and darker pixels are lower elevation. And this is going to be the most technical part of my talk. What I've been exploring is ways to detrend the elevation map because I wasn't, and a lot of researchers aren't able to use ground control points. And so you'll see in the upper image, you'll see there's a lot of trend in it. There's brightness variation as you go from the right to the left. Now, that's not actual trend due to landscape variation. It's just phantom trend from the fact that you're not using ground control points. But there is also some trend in the terrain. So what I've been examining is methods that I'm trying to automate to automatically detrend the map. And once you subtract the trend from the elevation map, as in the bottom map, you can see the contrast is a lot more uniform. And so what that's showing you is plot height above ground level. What you can do is, someone spoke earlier about adaptive thresholding. You can just threshold this elevation histogram. And so using free software, and so you can see in here, you can pick a threshold just under 0.5. I chose one at about 0.3. But then you can try automating this using a clustering algorithm like k-means or adaptive thresholding. But the point is that by doing that thresholding, you can, which is a form of classification, you can create a map that removes everything below the plot height, right? And so that would remove pixels that are soil. So on the top is a true color image, and you can see the soil pixels are in there. But on the bottom, I set every other pixel to no data. And so this is really important, again, for mapping variation in chlorophyll. So you can see in this next map, it was like that first NDRE map I showed you, except the color ramp is not applied to pixels that are in shadow or pixels that are on soil. And so after you do this processing, you can overlay your plot boundaries and only analyze the leaf pixels. And so for nitrogen trials where you're trying to estimate variation in leaf nitrogen for things like nitrogen use and other factors, this is a proper approach to use. I'm just bringing this up because I've seen a lot of people in industry not doing the soil removal, and other academics not doing the soil removal for nitrogen analysis, just whole plot level. And so this is these are the things that I'm considering. There are other nuisances that you have to deal with when you're doing high-resolution drone imaging. Like I mentioned, the shadows. Shadows are bad news when you're using chlorophyll indices. You'll often get very meaningless values in soils. They're just wild, they're random, and also over soil, shadows in soil, because, well, there's no chlorophyll in them. And so you want to remove pixels where there is shadow. You also want to remove pixels where, I don't know if you can see in these bean leaves, oh, here's the pointer. See that leaf right there? That leaf is inverted. So is that one in these. So that's the abaxial side. And those have a different spectral reflectance than the top of the leaf. When you're conducting remote sensing, you're typically, for most vegetation indices and chlorophyll indices, you're assuming you're getting a signal coming from the leaf, but also from the top side of the leaf. What's really handy about a lot of these low-altitude drone flights we're getting is you can identify which leaves are flipped over. And the flipped leaves, I'm doing some studies with a graduate student on examining the influence of inverted leaves on retrieving biophysical characteristics. They do have an effect, and so you want to remove those. But once you remove the nuisances, which would be things like flowers, inverted leaves, shadows, and then remove things you theoretically don't want in there for nitrogen, like soil, then the data is prepared for analysis. So yeah, there's some soybeans with a similar thing. And so once the data is prepared for analysis, then I think it's ready that we can get proper conclusions for our screening efforts. And so when it comes to agronomy even, it could be things like yield data. I still don't think the way that yield data is treated is totally proper for delineating management zones and different things. There are extra steps that we need to do pre-treatment before we can run with analytics. And so those are some of the things I'm going to be looking at on the agronomy side. And so, for instance, there's this concept of average yield. There's one way to create management zones in agricultural fields, and that's by looking at is a section of a field above the average, the arithmetic mean? Is it consistently above the average? This is really problematic, especially as farmers are planting more and more hybrids, because the hybrids, the histogram, the distribution won't be a normal distribution. It'll often have a lot of skewness in there, and so the arithmetic mean is not a good measure of central tendency, right? And so I just got access to a lot of yield data, and I'm going to be mining it and trying to characterize the distributions to think, are there better measures of central tendency we can be using that are more accurate metrics for what's an average yield rather than the arithmetic mean, which is very sensitive to outliers. So that's one more aspect of it. What's this mean for ecosystem services and the whole agroecology of what we're conducting? Well, it relates to this idea of profitability mapping and land use management for marginal lands and how that affects ecosystem services. Because when we're doing monocropping, we have low diversity, but there's this hypothesis called the diversity stability hypothesis, which is basically saying as we have more diverse ecosystem constituents, then we have more stability in there, and we got better flow of energy through the ecosystem. Typically in precision ag, what you do is you just collect the yield data, you clean it up, and it'll show you how variable a field is. But what profitability mapping can do, and there's a Dr. Clarence Swanton is espousing this a lot, is basically saying, well, we'll map how profitable a field is, and well, how much it costs you to produce the crop in certain parts of a field, and see if there are any areas that are just consistently underperforming to where it might not even be worth planting the seed, putting the seed down. And those are areas that you might want to use for conservation or planting a cover crop or doing something else with. And if you would have taken a loss on these part of the fields anyway, then you may as well do something good for the ecosystem and putting ecosystem service benefits in. And so I think if we can make improvements on how we conceptualize high-performing zones and how we put more economics into the practice of precision agriculture, then we can start figuring out other strategies for management practices that promote the growth and presence of ecosystem services. And so the questions become after this, how stable or resilient are our agroecosystems? Are there threshold levels of biodiversity that are required to protect them? And can we use precision ag tools to inventory ecosystem services? This is one of the things I'm really interested in. One of the things I did with canola, which I still haven't published but I presented several times, is I came up with a very simple algorithm to map when flowering starts, when it reaches peak bloom, and then when bloom ends. And I've automated that using satellite imagery. But we can apply the same technique potentially to apple orchards and try to look at that over time to see what are the temporal differences in phenology on when bloom starts, when different parts of a field reach maximum bloom, and relate that back to pollinator habitat availability. And so this could have management implications for orchard managers for basically protecting or putting in more habitat for pollinators. So it's more of a using a precision ag technology like satellite imaging, which satellite data is becoming more and more abundant and available, and there's even some good archives going back. But can we use this data for direct farm management, but just for also estimating different things that could relate to decision making on beehive placement, or like I said, should a farmer consider putting more habitat in there for things like bees? There are some limitations in doing this, and probably the biggest one there is in trying to do sustainable food production and this whole ecosystem services thing is it's really hard to link profitability to a value system. It's really hard to get a farmer to not do insurance. Like, we can come up with algorithms and tell a farmer, oh, well, you can put less nitrogen down in this part of the field. They'll still put more nitrogen down there just as insurance. You know, we could say, well, this part of the field, it's not so productive. It's probably not going to be worth putting seed there, so you should put some, maybe a pollinator habitat there or something else, a cover crop. And they could say, well, maybe not. I'm just going to go with the thing that might make me money, right? And we're trying to come up with methods and techniques to help improve the environment and account for losses and say, oh, well, there's an opportunity cost here, or maybe there isn't. But the real challenge in all of this, besides the technical aspect of it, which is really fun, doing the image analysis and stuff like that, is how do we convince growers to actually make these changes and that it's worthwhile? That's going to be the biggest challenge, I think, in the Food from Thought program, is just trying to change mindsets for what's an insurance practice. And so that's everything I got for you. Actually, one last thing. I saw someone speak recently at a digital agriculture symposium. David Schmelpfennig, he works for the USDA Economic Research Service, and he had a report that he put out a couple of years ago that I hadn't heard about. And if you're interested in precision agriculture, you absolutely have to read this report. It's so interesting. And just to summarize it, he said, well, precision ag technologies, GPS auto guidance, auto steering, section control to make sure you don't duplicate application of fertilizer or some type of herbicide or something in a field. These are very straightforward things that have added value to growers, and they're really hard to dispute. There's been this expectation that things like variable rate technology would come in after them and basically be a slam dunk, but they haven't demonstrated a value proposition consistently. And this has a lot of people concerned about the direction that, is there a return on investment for a lot of different precision agriculture technologies? Because oftentimes, just like the ROI just does not go through for variable rate applications. It's just like we thought that with auto steer and section control, it would be a slam dunk, or we could just spike with the variable rate. It's just that there are often very inconclusive results from that. So we've got challenges there on, again, like I mentioned, how do we have a stronger basis for delineating management zones so that we can vary things like nitrogen or plant population, seeding rates, things like that. Okay, now I'm done, I promise. All right.